My name is Clara Rowe, and for the past 10 years, my life has been measured in the quiet scent of aging paper and the soft hum of climate control. I am the archivist for the Finch and Sparrow Legacy Trust, a firm so old and steeped in the history of Port Blossom that its granite facade seems to have grown from the city's very bedrock. My grandfather, a man who believed in the sanctity of a well-kept ledger, worked in this same building as a clerk, and I suppose a piece of his reverence for order and history settled deep in my own bones. My domain was the subbasement, a meticulously organized world of vellum, ink, and acid-free boxes. Here, the company's soul resided in leather-bound volumes and forgotten deeds, a stark contrast to the polished glass and aggressive ambition of the executive floors above. Up there, the air was thin and sharp with the scent of modern commerce. Down here, it was thick with the stories of what the firm once was, a bastion of civic patronage, a steward of Port Blossom's growth. I loved my work. I loved the tangible connection to a past that felt more solid and principled than the present. But I was, in the eyes of the firm's current leadership, little more than a piece of that past, a relic, like the documents I curated. Useful for locating an old property line, but otherwise invisible, silent, and entirely out of place in their forward-marching world. The man who most embodied this new world was Julian Croft, our CEO. He was a man sculpted from ambition and tailored suits, with a smile that never quite reached his eyes. He saw Finch and Sparrow not as a legacy to be honored, but as a vessel for acquisition, a name to leverage for bigger, more lucrative ventures. To him, the history I so carefully preserved was just branding. I still remember the exact moment, like a freeze frame in my mind, when the quiet acceptance I had cultivated for a decade finally began to fracture. It was a Tuesday, the rain outside streaking the high, small windows of the archive, making the world beyond seem like a watercolor painting left out in a storm. Julian and a team of executives had descended into my sanctuary, their polished shoes clicking impatiently on the stone floor. They were finalizing the acquisition of the Silverwood Guild, a local artisan collective renowned for its silversmiths and woodcarvers. The deal was valued at $12 million, a figure that felt alien and jarring amidst the gentle quiet of my archive. They needed the original land grant for the guild's property, a document I knew intimately. I retrieved the heavy, calfskin-bound folder and laid it on the large oak reading table. As Julian's team pored over the maps, their voices sharp and dismissive of the elegant, spidery script, I noticed they were overlooking a series of addendums from the city's founding charter. "Mr. Croft," I said, my voice softer than I intended. It was always a struggle to project it outside the stillness of my archive. "You might want the legal team to look at these covenants. Specifically, the heritage preservation clauses." Julian, who had been staring at his phone, looked up as if noticing for the first time that I was a person and not a piece of furniture. He offered a tight, patronizing smile. "Clara," he said, the name sounding like a gentle reprimand. "You're the archivist, not a city planner. Why don't you stick to keeping the dust off these things, shall we?" A few of his associates chuckled, a low, sycophantic sound that echoed unpleasantly in the vaulted room. I felt a familiar heat rise in my cheeks, the blush of humiliation I had learned to swallow down like a bitter pill. But this time, it felt different. The Silverwood Guild wasn't just another asset on a balance sheet. It was a living piece of Port Blossom's soul, a place where my own grandmother had bought her wedding silver. His dismissal wasn't just of me, it was of the very history he was pretending to acquire. I held his gaze for a fraction longer than I normally would have dared. "It's on page 14, subsection C," I said, my voice steadier this time. "It grants stewardship rights to a designated party if the cultural integrity of the property is threatened by a commercial transfer." It was a failsafe written into the city's original charter. Julian scoffed, a sharp, ugly sound that cut through the respectful silence of the room. "Clara, please. I have a team from the best law firm in the state working on this. If they aren't worried, I'm not worried. And I don't pay you to interpret 100-year-old scribbles. I pay you to file them." The room fell silent. Some of his team shuffled their papers, refusing to meet my eye. Others wore faint smirks. I simply nodded, the gesture a well-worn habit of concession. "Of course, sir. But inside, a tectonic plate shifted. For 10 years, I had accepted the condescending pats on the head, the casual erasure of my expertise, the glass ceiling so low in my part of the building that I had to stoop. I told myself it was the price of a quiet life, of doing the work I loved. This, however, was not just arrogance. It was a willful, destructive ignorance. And as I watched them pack up their briefcases, their laughter echoing as they ascended the stairs back to their world of consequence, I knew I could not let it stand. That night, long after the cleaning crew had finished their rounds, their friendly waves a small comfort in the vast, empty building, I remained at the reading table. The rain had softened to a gentle patter against the glass. The only light was the warm glow of my desk lamp, illuminating the delicate script of the city charter. I wasn't just preparing notes. I was reading with a new purpose, a cold, clear focus that had been gathering in me for years. And what I found confirmed everything. The Heritage Preservation Covenant was not just a historical curiosity, it was legally binding. It allowed a third party, if they could prove a connection to the city's heritage and pay a symbolic filing fee to the Historical Society, to assume stewardship and veto any sale that would fundamentally alter the property's charter. The fee, established in 1923, was $100. It was a clause designed to protect the city's character from unchecked avarice, a relic of a more idealistic time. It was an oversight so archaic that a modern legal team, focused on profit margins and liability, would have dismissed it as irrelevant. They had seen the words, but they hadn't understood their weight. My hands trembled as I traced the faded ink, but it wasn't with fear. It was with a strange, burgeoning power. I had always believed the power in this building resided on the top floor, in the corner offices with panoramic views of the Hawthorne Bridge. But I was wrong. The real power was down here, buried in the fine print, in the promises made by the city's founders. It was a power accessible to anyone who took the time to read, to understand, and to care. I made a decision in the deep, silent hours of that night. It was a decision that would unravel the quiet, predictable tapestry of my life. I was not a reckless person. My entire existence was built on caution and care. But I knew Julian Croft and men like him. They wouldn't just acquire the Silverwood Guild, they would hollow it out, replace the artisan workshops with luxury condos, and sell off its name. They would erase a piece of our city's story. And I, the quiet archivist, was the only person who knew how to stop them. The clock was ticking. The deal was set to close in less than a week. Julian Croft had no idea that while he was planning his victory party, I was about to become the legal guardian of the very soul he was trying to buy. The next morning, the office hummed with its usual predictable rhythm. The scent of fresh coffee wafted from the break room, mingling with the faint, clean smell of photocopier toner. I sat at my desk in the small office, just off the main archive, cataloging a new set of correspondence from the 1950s. On the surface, I was the same Clara Rowe I had been the day before, quiet, diligent, a ghost in the corporate machine. But nestled in my leather satchel, beside my thermos and my lunch, was a manila envelope. Inside was a cashier's check for $100, made out to the Port Blossom Historical Society, and a carefully printed claim form. I had spent the better part of the previous evening not just rereading the Covenant, but researching my own history. My great-aunt, Elspeth Rowe, had been one of the founding members of the Silverwood Guild's Preservation Committee in the 1940s. Her name was on the charter. That was my connection, my standing. It wasn't just a legal claim. It was a familial one. I wasn't just an archivist. I was a descendant of one of its protectors. I had called my brother, Daniel, the night before. He's a high school history teacher, a man who shares my reverence for the past, but possesses a practical streak I often lack. I explained the situation, my voice trembling slightly over the phone. "So, you're telling me," he'd said, a note of incredulous admiration in his voice, "that you found a 100-year-old, $100 loophole to stop a $12 million deal?" Essentially, I'd whispered, "Clara, this is huge. Are you sure? Croft will come after you." "I know," I said, and the certainty in my own voice surprised me. "But what's the alternative, Dan?" "To just sit here and file away the memory of what the guild used to be." There was a pause. No, he said finally. You're right. Do it. Be smart about it, but do it. His validation was the final piece of resolve I needed. At 12:15 p.m., during the quiet lull of the lunch hour, I left the office. I didn't go to a soulless notary office in a strip mall. I walked the 10 blocks to City Hall, its grand, Beaux-Arts dome a familiar beacon against the gray sky. I went to the Office of Civic Records, a place that smelled even more profoundly of old paper than my own archive. The clerk behind the counter was a woman named Mrs. Gable, who had worked there for 40 years and had helped me with research countless times. She had sharp, intelligent eyes behind her spectacles. She read my form, then looked at the attached copy of the covenant, and then back at me. A slow, knowing smile spread across her face. Well, she murmured, stamping the document with a satisfying, definitive thud. It's been a long time since anyone's invoked a heritage covenant. A very long time. She took my check. I hope this brings about the intended result, Ms. Rowe. I hope so, too, Mrs. Gable, I said, my heart a frantic drum against my ribs. I walked back to the office, the city air feeling fresher, sharper. Nothing had changed. Julian's executive assistant was on the phone, laughing about a weekend trip. One of the vice presidents was striding down the hall, barking into his phone about profit margins. From behind the glass walls of his office, Julian was commanding a meeting, his gesture sharp and emphatic. I sat at my desk, logged into my computer, and began my work, the world continuing to spin as if I hadn't just nudged it off its axis. For 2 days, a heavy silence followed my action. I began to feel a creeping dread. Had I miscalculated? Was the covenant so archaic it would simply be dismissed by a modern court? I had risked my career, my quiet life, on a clause written by men long dead. The weight of that risk settled in my chest, making it hard to breathe. I slept little, replaying the confrontation with Julian, the conversation with Daniel, the thud of Mrs. Gable's stamp, over and over in my mind. Then, on the third morning, the shift began. It was subtle at first. At 9:30 a.m., one of the senior lawyers from the firm handling the acquisition arrived, his face pale and grim. He disappeared into Julian's office. The door, usually left ajar in a display of accessibility that was purely for show, was pulled firmly shut. Their voices were low, but the angry, clipped cadence reached me even through the heavy oak. By noon, the entire legal team was in an emergency session in the main boardroom. I saw them through the glass, their faces a mixture of panic and disbelief. The whispers started in the afternoon, rippling out from the executive suite like aftershocks. Something's wrong with the Silverwood deal. I heard a claim was filed. Froze the title transfer. Who would file a claim? A rival company. I kept my head down, focusing on the delicate task of mending a tear in a 19th century map. I could feel glances flickering my way, but no one suspected me. I was Clara, the quiet archivist. I was part of the scenery, not the plot. Late that afternoon, Julian strode past my desk. He didn't look at me, but I saw the rigid set of his shoulders, the furious clench of his jaw. The smug, condescending man who had dismissed me in my own archive was gone. In his place was a man cornered, and I knew a cornered man was a dangerous one. I went home that night with my heart pounding, not with fear, but with a strange, terrifying calm. It was working. My $100 check and a piece of forgotten history had thrown a wrench into the gears of Julian Croft's multi-million-dollar machine. But this was only the beginning. I knew men like Julian. They didn't concede. They didn't reflect on their mistakes. They identified the obstacle and applied overwhelming force until it was crushed. And I had just made myself a very, very inconvenient obstacle. The call came the next morning before I had even finished my first cup of tea. The screen lit up with a name I had never expected to see on my personal phone, Julian Croft. My hand trembled as I reached for it, my thumb hovering over the green icon. I took a deep, steadying breath, picturing my grandfather's calm, steady face. Then I answered. "Clara," he said. His voice was strained, attempting a corporate politeness that felt as thin as ice on a winter puddle. "I need to see you in my office." "Now." "Of course, Mr. Croft," I replied, my own voice surprisingly even. "I'll be right in." As I walked through the hushed corridors of the office, I felt the weight of 100 pairs of eyes. The whispers ceased as I passed. The invisible woman was suddenly, starkly visible. But for the first time, their scrutiny didn't make me feel small. It made me feel solid. I was no longer a ghost haunting the archives. I was a person walking toward a reckoning. And Julian Croft was about to discover that the quietest people are often the ones who have been listening the most. This wasn't a game I had started, but I knew the rules. And this time, I was going to play. Julian's office was on the top floor, a cavern of glass and steel that offered a breathtaking panorama of Port Blossom. It was designed to make visitors feel small and insignificant. As I stepped inside, he was standing by the window, his back to me, a silhouette against the morning sky. He looked like a king surveying his domain. I closed the heavy door behind me, the soft click echoing in the silence. "Clara," he said, finally turning. His voice was low, almost casual, but his eyes were hard. "Have a seat." I sat in one of the leather chairs facing his massive desk. He remained standing, a deliberate power play. "I received a rather perplexing communication from the city's legal department this morning," he began, pacing slowly. "It seems a heritage preservation covenant has been invoked against the Silverwood Guild property." I said nothing, simply watched him. My stillness seemed to unnerve him more than any argument would have. His jaw tightened. Imagine my profound surprise when I learned that the claim was filed by my own archivist. I met his gaze directly. My hands were folded calmly in my lap, a small island of composure in the storm of his anger. I followed the procedure outlined in the city charter and the company's own foundational documents. It is a legal and valid claim. He let out a short, humorless laugh. "Legal? You went behind my back, behind this company's back, and deliberately sabotaged a $12 million deal. You had no right." "On the contrary," I said, my voice soft but unyielding. "I exercised a right that your legal team, and you, chose to ignore. The covenant exists to protect cultural assets. As of my filing, the stewardship of the Guild's charter is, for the moment, with me." His eyes narrowed to slits. "What is this? A shakedown? Is that your game, Clara?" I felt a flash of anger, hot and clean. "A game? Mr. Croft, you're the one who treats this company's legacy like a game." He finally moved, circling his desk and sinking into his chair. He leaned forward, clasping his hands, trying to regain control. The mask of the calculating CEO slipped back into place. "All right, let's cut the dramatics. You saw a vulnerability and you exploited it. I can almost respect the nerve. Name your price. How much will it take to make this little problem go away? I'll have a check cut and a non-disclosure agreement drawn up this afternoon." The offer hung in the air between us, crass and insulting. He truly believed that everyone had a price, that principals were just negotiating positions. I held his gaze. "I didn't file the claim for money." His confident smile faltered. "Then what? What could you possibly want?" I leaned forward just slightly, closing the space between us. "I want you to understand something. I filed that claim because when I tried to warn you, you dismissed me. You treated me, and the history I am paid to protect, as if we were nothing more than dust. You chose to ignore a warning that could have saved this company embarrassment and legal trouble. This isn't about a negotiation, Mr. Croft. This is about accountability." For the first time since I'd known him, I saw a flicker of genuine uncertainty in his eyes. His confidence, built on a foundation of money and intimidation, was wavering in the face of a motive he couldn't comprehend. "You realize," he said, his voice dropping to a low threat, "that this will not end well for you. You have made a powerful enemy." I offered a small, sad smile. "You were my enemy long before this, Mr. Croft. You just didn't notice." I stood, my legs feeling steadier than I ever thought they would. I walked to the door, my heart a steady, rhythmic beat. "You think you're smarter than me?" he called out, his voice laced with venom. I paused with my hand on the doorknob and turned to look at him one last time, a man trapped in a glass tower of his own making. "No, Julian," I said, using his first name for the first and only time. "I just think I did the reading." And then I left, closing the door softly behind me. The hours that followed my confrontation with Julian were surreal. I returned to the sanctuary of my archive, the familiar scent of old paper a comforting balm to my frayed nerves. I tried to work, but my hands trembled slightly. The office outside my door was a sea of tension. The whispers were no longer just whispers. They were charged with a frantic energy. Word travels with the speed of light in a corporate environment, and the story of the quiet archivist facing down the CEO was spreading like wildfire. I wasn't naive. I knew Julian's offer of a buyout was just the opening salvo. When that failed, he would move to the next weapon in his arsenal: destruction of my credibility. The first blow landed at 4:52 p.m. An email, stark and official, appeared in my inbox. The sender was the head of human resources. The subject line read, "Formal inquiry into professional misconduct." I opened it. My pulse, which had finally begun to slow, picked up again, but it was a steady, rhythmic beat, not a frantic flutter. The email detailed an investigation into my unauthorized use of privileged information and deliberate interference with a corporate contract. It was a classic corporate attack: frame the whistleblower as a disgruntled, rogue employee. Discredit the person to discredit the claim. But I was ready. For 10 years, I had watched how this company operated, how it silenced dissent and managed problems. I had learned from their playbook. I calmly forwarded the email to a new address in my contacts: Eleanor Vance, ESQ. I had hired a lawyer 2 days ago. My brother Daniel had a friend from college, Eleanor, a sharp, principled woman who ran a small practice specializing in employment law and ethics. She wasn't a corporate behemoth, and that's precisely why I chose her. She fought for people, not for portfolios. Julian thought this was his game, played on his field. He hadn't yet realized I had changed the rules. The next morning, the escalation was immediate and punitive. I arrived at my desk to find my computer screen dark. When I tried to log in, a blunt message flashed in red: "Access denied. Please contact its support." At 8:45 a.m., I was summoned not to Julian's office, but to a sterile, windowless conference room in the HR department. 2 people were waiting for me: Sarah, the director of HR who had always been perfectly pleasant but whose loyalty was to the company, and a stern-faced man I didn't recognize, who introduced himself as corporate counsel. "Clara," Sarah began, her hands folded neatly on the table. "As you know, there is an ongoing inquiry. Pending the results of that investigation, we've been instructed to temporarily suspend your system access." I nodded slowly, my expression calm. "An inquiry related to the perfectly legal and publicly documented heritage claim I filed as a private citizen, using my own resources and my own time?" A flicker of discomfort crossed Sarah's face. The lawyer's expression remained impassive. "We are simply following protocol, Ms. Rowe," he said, his voice flat. "As am I replied. I reached into my satchel and retrieved a slim folder. I slid it across the table. It was a letter from Eleanor. It formally stated that any punitive or retaliatory action taken against me, including suspension of duties, restriction of access, or public or private character defamation, in response to my legally protected civic action, would be met with a swift and comprehensive lawsuit for wrongful termination and retaliation. The lawyer's lips thinned as he read it. "Is this a threat, Ms. Rowe?" I met his gaze without flinching. "No, it's a statement of fact. It's the protocol I'm following." A heavy silence filled the small room. Sarah looked from the letter to me, her corporate composure cracking slightly. She knew I had them. They had overplayed their hand, assuming I would be an easy target to intimidate. "We will take this under review," she said stiffly. I left the HR department and walked back through the office. I had no work to do, no computer to log into. I was in a state of corporate limbo. The whispers followed me, now tinged with a new kind of awe and fear. "They locked her out. HR has her on the ropes. She's done for." But I wasn't done for. I was building a case. Every move Julian made against me was another piece of evidence of his bad faith. He was trying to push me out, to force me to resign so he could tell the board I was a disgruntled employee who had quit under pressure. But I wasn't going to walk away. At 2 o'clock, I met Eleanor at a small coffee shop tucked away in the old mercantile district, a place of worn wooden floors and the rich smell of roasted coffee beans. She was a calming presence, her sharp mind belied by a warm smile. "They're acting exactly as we predicted," she said after I recounted the morning's events. She slid a document across the table toward me. "This is a preemptive injunction. We'll file it tomorrow morning. It puts them on formal notice with the court. If they make one more move against you, they won't be answering to you or to me. They'll be answering to a judge. In public." I looked at the legal jargon, but I understood the strategy. Julian thrived in the shadows, in the closed-door meetings and the hushed threats. The last thing he wanted was public scrutiny. "He'll never risk that," I said quietly. "The board would be furious if this became a public spectacle." Eleanor smiled faintly. "That's the point, Clara. We're not playing his game anymore. We're playing ours." The next day, the atmosphere in the office underwent another seismic shift. The tension didn't lessen, it changed direction. It was no longer focused on me, the rogue archivist. It was now aimed squarely at Julian Croft. The news of my legal action, of the injunction, had clearly worked its way up the chain of command. People were starting to ask the right questions. Why was the company spending so much energy trying to crush a single employee? How did an archivist, of all people, find a flaw that a high-powered legal team had missed? What was Julian so desperate to hide? The CFO, a man who had always treated me with polite indifference, now actively avoided my gaze in the hallway. Two of the VPs fell silent as I passed them whispering by the elevators. The narrative was slipping from Julian's control. And then, late that afternoon, the call I had been half expecting, half dreading, finally came. It wasn't from Julian or HR. It was from the personal assistant to Alastair Finch. Mr. Finch was the chairman of the board. He was the grandson of one of the original founders, a quiet, dignified man in his late 70s who rarely involved himself in the day-to-day operations. He was the firm's conscience, its living link to the legacy Julian held in such contempt. "Ms. Rowe," his assistant's voice was crisp and polite. "Mr. Finch would like to have a word with you. In the main boardroom. At your convenience." I sat at the large, polished table in the main boardroom, the same room where I had been dismissed so casually just a week before. This time, however, I was not an afterthought. I was the main agenda. Across from me sat Alastair Finch. He was not like Julian. He didn't radiate power. He embodied a quiet authority. He had kind, weary eyes that had seen the company through decades of change. For 20 minutes, he simply listened. He didn't interrupt. He didn't posture. He just let me speak. With a calm, steady voice, I laid out the entire story. The discovery of the covenant, my warning to Julian, his public dismissal of my concern, the filing of the claim, the company's subsequent retaliation, and the legal steps I had taken to protect myself. I had brought a file with me, copies of the covenant, a timeline of events, the email from HR, the letter from my lawyer. It was all factual, professional, and devoid of emotion. When I finished, Mr. Finch sat back, steepling his long, elegant fingers. The silence stretched, filled only by the distant hum of the city. "You have placed this firm in a remarkably difficult position, Ms. Rowe," he said finally, his voice a low, gravelly baritone. I met his eyes. "With all due respect, sir, Julian Croft placed the firm in this position. I simply brought it to light. I upheld a principle that is written into this company's very history." He exhaled slowly, a long, weary sound, and gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "You are not wrong." He looked down at the file I had given him. "You have given the board a great deal to consider." He looked back up at me. "I would appreciate your discretion in the coming days. Please do not speak to the press." I gave him a small, respectful smile. "Mr. Finch, I am not looking for a headline. I am looking for a resolution that honors the Silverwood Guild and the integrity of this firm." He nodded again, this time with a hint of a smile. "Understood, Ms. Rowe. We will be in touch." As I left the boardroom, I felt a profound sense of release. I had done everything I could. I had spoken my truth to the one person who might actually be able to hear it. Julian had mistaken my quietness for weakness, my diligence for passivity. But he had forgotten one crucial thing: you cannot intimidate someone who is fighting for something larger than themselves. I wasn't fighting for a job anymore. I was fighting for the soul of a place. By Monday morning, the Finch and Sparrow Legacy Trust felt like a different world. The frantic, nervous energy of the previous week had been replaced by a heavy, expectant silence. Julian's glass-walled office was dark, the door closed. Alistair Finch was on site, a rare occurrence that sent waves of speculation through the ranks. All morning, a parade of executives, the head of legal, the CFO, the director of HR, was called up to the top-floor boardroom for quiet, closed-door meetings. I remained in my archive, the eye of the storm. I spent the morning carefully restoring a set of architectural drawings of the old city market, the meticulous work a balm to my soul. People gave my office a wide berth, as if it were roped off. I was no longer just Clara the archivist. I was an unknown quantity, a catalyst for a change no one had seen coming. At 2:15 p.m., Mr. Finch's assistant appeared at my door. "Ms. Rowe, the board is ready for you." I followed her up to the top floor. This time, the entire board was present, a collection of solemn-faced men and women seated around the long mahogany table. Julian was at the far end, his face pale and set like stone. He looked smaller, diminished, stripped of his usual aura of command. Mr. Finch gestured to an empty chair near his own, directly across the table from Julian. I took my seat. The room was silent. "We have spent the morning reviewing the situation regarding the Silverwood Guild acquisition," Mr. Finch began, his voice carrying the full weight of his authority. "We have reviewed the original contracts, the city charters, Ms. Rowe's documentation, and reports from our legal and human resources departments. We have also consulted with independent counsel." He paused, his gaze sweeping across the table. "The conclusion is inescapable. This firm has been exposed to significant legal and financial risk due to a failure of leadership and a severe lapse in due diligence." A quiet murmur went through the room. Mr. Finch turned to me. "Ms. Rowe, to confirm for the record, you acted as a private citizen, using your own resources to file this claim?" "Yes, sir. I did." "And you did not use any proprietary company information unavailable through public records?" "No, sir. The covenant is part of the public city charter. My own family's connection to the guild is a matter of historical record." Mr. Finch nodded once. "Thank you." He then turned his attention to the other end of the table. "Mr. Croft, were you, or were you not, made aware of this potential covenant issue by Ms. Rowe prior to the claim being filed?" Julian's jaw clenched. He shot a venomous glare in my direction. She mumbled something. "A simple yes or no will suffice, Julian," Mr. Finch said, his tone icy. Julian's nostrils flared. "Yes," he bit out. "And did you direct your legal team to investigate her concern?" I deemed it unnecessary," Julian muttered. "An archivist's opinion on a complex legal matter." "You dismissed it," Mr. Finch stated, cutting him off. The words hung in the air, an indictment. The next hour was a slow, methodical dismantling of Julian Croft's tenure. The board reviewed his handling of the deal, his categorical dismissal of a valid concern, and, most damningly, his coordinated attempt to retaliate against and discredit me after I had acted to protect the company from his own negligence. My formal complaint, filed by Eleanor, was the final nail in the coffin. Julian attempted to defend himself, shifting blame to his subordinates, to the lawyers, even suggesting I had acted out of personal malice. But the facts, laid out in the documents before them, were stark and irrefutable. I didn't have to say a word. My careful record-keeping had spoken for me. Finally, Mr. Finch delivered the board's decision. Effective immediately, Julian Croft is removed from his position as Chief Executive Officer of this firm. The board will appoint an interim leader while we conduct a search for a permanent replacement. You may collect your personal belongings. Your access has been revoked." Julian sat stunned, his face a mask of disbelief. He opened his mouth to argue, but the united, stony faces of the board members told him it was useless. He looked at me, his expression not of anger anymore, but of utter, baffled incomprehension. I simply met his gaze, my own expression neutral. For once, he was speechless. After the meeting adjourned and Julian was quietly escorted out, Mr. Finch pulled me aside. "You conducted yourself with remarkable grace and professionalism, Ms. Rowe," he said quietly. "The board recognizes and respects that." "Thank you, Mr. Finch. We will, of course, need to address the claim you have filed," he continued. "The lawyers for the Silverwood Guild are, understandably, asking a great many questions." "I'm ready to help find a solution," I said. And I meant it. This had never been about stopping the deal, but about ensuring it was done right. The formal announcement of Julian's departure went out in a brief internal memo the next day, citing a mutual decision to pursue new opportunities. No one believed it. The real story, in its various whispered forms, was already common knowledge. Mr. Finch was appointed interim CEO, and his first act was to completely restructure the Silverwood negotiation. He asked me to be a part of the new team, not as a silent archivist, but as a formal advisor. "You understand the spirit of this deal better than anyone," he told me. "And you've proven you know how to read the fine print." I agreed, on one condition, that my stewardship claim be used to guarantee the Guild's artisans retain their workshops and creative autonomy under the new ownership. Mr. Finch agreed without hesitation. Over the next 3 weeks, we worked with the Silverwood Guild, not as conquerors, but as partners. We drafted an agreement that protected their heritage while providing the financial stability they needed. When the deal finally closed, it was celebrated not as a corporate victory, but as a civic triumph. One evening, after the final papers were signed, I found myself alone in the boardroom, looking out at the city lights twinkling over Port Blossom. It had been a lifetime ago that I stood in my archive, feeling invisible. I had learned that respect isn't something that is given freely, sometimes it must be claimed. You have to know your own worth, quietly and firmly, before you can expect anyone else to see it. Mr. Finch joined me by the window, holding 2 mugs of tea. He handed one to me. "The board has been talking, Clara," he said. I raised an eyebrow. "That sounds ominous." He smiled faintly. "Quite the opposite. We are creating a new position. Director of Legacy and Ethics. It will be a senior role, reporting directly to the board, tasked with ensuring that this firm's future actions are always in alignment with its founding principles." He paused. "The position is yours if you want it." I was stunned into silence. A real position, born from the chaos, designed for me. "Why me?" I finally managed to ask. His smile faded, replaced by a look of sincere respect. "Because you didn't just save this company from a costly mistake, Clara. You reminded us of who we are supposed to be. And you did it not for power or for money, but because it was the right thing to do." I accepted. My new office isn't on the top floor. It's on the 2nd floor, with a lovely view of the old oak tree in the courtyard. There's no grand title on the door, just my name. It's a quiet space, but it's a space with a voice. I sometimes think about Julian. I heard he took a job with a venture capital firm on the other side of the country, a place of pure profit with no history to get in the way. Perhaps he's happier there. His fate is no longer my concern. My own battle was not for revenge. It was a fight to be heard. It was a fight to prove that the quietest corners of the world often hold the most profound truths, and that history, if we listen, has lessons for us all. I didn't set out to start a revolution. I just refused to remain silent. And in the quiet hum of my new office, I know, with a certainty that fills my soul, that has made all the difference.